Son las 6 de la tarde. Doctor Cabello, ¿esperamos unos minuticos o iniciamos ya? ¿Tú qué dices? No te oímos. Ah, ya.
Perfecto, gracias. Esperamos, pues ya pasaron 2 minutos, 1 minuto más y empezamos.
1 minuto, perfecto, doctor Cabello.
Bien, damos inicio entonces. En este momento ya son las 6:03 de la tarde.
Perfecto. Buenas tardes para todos. Un placer darles la bienvenida a esta segunda presentación del ciclo de conferencias México Cero Asbesto 2022, que lleva por título La ciencia del asbesto, consideraciones importantes para el desarrollo de un plan nacional del asbesto en México, a cargo del reconocido experto internacional, el señor Sean Fitzgerald. Como muchos de ustedes lo saben, durante los meses de agosto, septiembre, octubre y noviembre, se adelantará este ciclo de conferencias que hacen parte del proyecto de investigación Abordaje transdisciplinario de la epidemia de mesotelioma maligno pleural por exposición al asbesto en la comunidad de San Pedro Barrientos, coordinado por un grupo de expertos académicos que desde el pensamiento científico y las ciencias sociales, junto a la comunidad de San Pedro Barrientos, se han atrevido a imaginar un México cero de asbesto, desde una dimensión transdisciplinaria, coordinados por el doctor Alejandro Cabello y el liderazgo de una figura importante como la doctora Guadalupe Aguilar, en quien reconocemos una larga batalla contra el asbesto en México desde hace varios años. Ese trabajo, doctora Guadalupe, nos conduce sin lugar a duda para que mediante todo este ejercicio de coordinación logremos avanzar hacia un México libre de asbesto más temprano que tarde. Para dar inicio a este evento, quiero cederle la palabra al doctor Alejandro Cabello López, médico cirujano de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, maestro en ciencias por el Instituto Karolinska de Suecia. Actualmente cursa un doctorado en epidemiología e investigación clínica en la Universidad de Duisburgo-Essen en Alemania. El doctor Cabello está adscrito a la Unidad de Investigación de Salud en el Trabajo del Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social y ha trabajado temas de salud ocupacional, entre ellos cáncer por asbesto, efectos tóxicos de disolventes orgánicos y plomo en poblaciones trabajadoras. Posterior a las palabras del doctor Cabello, procederé a presentarles a nuestro invitado internacional y así dar inicio formal a esta, nuestra segunda conferencia del ciclo México Cero Asbesto 2022. Adelante, doctor Cabello, tiene usted el uso de la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Guillermo, y muchas gracias a todos y a todas por acudir a esta segunda plática que se inauguró la semana pasada. Brevemente, para poner en contexto a aquellas personas que es la primera ocasión que se incorporan a este ciclo de seminarios, primero, pues darles la bienvenida, agradecer la atención que nos dan, el tiempo que nos brindan, y segundo, pues platicar un poco el contexto en el cual se dan estas conferencias, estos seminarios que han sido organizados por el grupo encabezados por mi persona, y que agradecemos mucho el trabajo y la gestión que ha hecho también Guillermo y el grupo en general. En resumen, esta propuesta se plantea, además de la prohibición del uso del asbesto en México, se plantea 5 diferentes estrategias para abordar el problema de contaminación ambiental y los efectos a la salud que el asbesto provoca. En primer lugar, está la parte de monitoreo ambiental, en el cual pretendemos documentar esta contaminación a nivel ambiental en la comunidad a la cual Guillermo ya se ha referido aquí en la Ciudad de México. Además de esto, se pretende hacer una estrategia de vigilancia a la salud por el uso de biomarcadores no invasivos y económicos para la detección oportuna del mesotelioma maligno pleural, una neoplasia altamente letal y relacionada en cerca del 90% de las veces con la exposición al asbesto. En el tercer eje se encuentran las políticas públicas y las cuestiones legales que nos permitirán precisamente lograr y alcanzar este objetivo, esperemos que en un mediano plazo. En el cuarto eje se encuentra la parte de organización y educación, así como la difusión y comunicación de estos riesgos y de la experiencia de trabajo que se ha llevado a cabo durante ya casi 2 años. Por último, existe dentro de la intención de este grupo conformar una actividad con la comunidad afectada para fortalecer la capacidad de respuesta ante escenarios como lo son los corredores industriales, en donde generalmente existe contaminación y efectos a la salud relacionados a estas contaminaciones. Nuevamente agradezco la participación de todos y cada uno de ustedes en esta conferencia, en este seminario, y como ha escrito también Guillermo, agradecemos a quien está a cargo de la traducción simultánea, tanto al idioma español como al idioma inglés, que nos ha sido de mucha utilidad para que el mensaje llegue a todas las personas asistentes. Y sin más preámbulo, les doy la palabra a Guillermo para que dé la presentación de nuestro invitado, al cual le agradezco mucho a Sean Fitzgerald por su presencia, por el tiempo y por la experiencia que nos va a compartir. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, doctor Cabello, muy amable. El doctor Sean Fitzgerald es un geólogo profesional y microscopista con más de 35 años de experiencia en el estudio de la ciencia y la geología del asbesto, la sílice respirable y los metales pesados, centrándose en la interrelación entre estos materiales, tal y como se producen de forma natural, procesados por el hombre y su potencial impacto negativo en la salud humana, al tiempo que gestiona empresas en crecimiento y laboratorios medioambientales. El señor Fitzgerald ha sido inspector de sitios de remediación, analista experto, gerente regional, geólogo de campo y director de laboratorio. Y ha tenido títulos ejecutivos como vicepresidente de desarrollo de negocios y presidente de empresas ambientales en todo Estados Unidos. El señor Fitzgerald ha sido ponente invitado en talleres y conferencias sobre medio ambiente, además de reuniones y revisiones de normativas locales, estatales, federales e internacionales, y ha sido contratado y solicitado en repetidas ocasiones como testigo experto. El señor Fitzgerald ha centrado su investigación y análisis en las fibras de asbesto, el asbesto en los suelos, el asbesto en el talco, el asbesto en los materiales de frenos para automóviles, el asbesto en los productos domésticos, el asbesto de origen natural, las pruebas de liberación y el análisis del tejido pulmonar, y su trabajo ha aparecido ante la EIA, ASTM también, la AIA, la GSA, la AEG, ISO, National Press Club, European Asbestos Forum, la British Occupational Hygiene Society, el Parlamento inglés y el Senado y la Cámara de Representantes de los Estados Unidos, participando en varios subcomités, y la US Food and Drug Administration. Las investigaciones históricas de Fitzgerald han desvelado la presencia de asbesto, sílice respirable y metales pesados como el plomo y el mercurio en juguetes infantiles, lápices de colores y cosméticos, entre otros. El testimonio experto del señor Fitzgerald en los tribunales desde Nueva York hasta California ha aportado una experiencia inestimable en lo que respecta a la geología, la mineralogía y los procedimientos de laboratorio, con el objetivo de aumentar el conocimiento científico y la sensibilización sobre el asbesto. Durante el proceso para darle desarrollo a la Ley 1968 de 2019, que prohibió el asbesto en Colombia, el señor Sean Fitzgerald ha acompañado en diferentes reuniones a la Fundación Colombia Libre de Asbesto como parte de las mesas de trabajo que adelanta el Ministerio de Medio Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible con las partes interesadas. La opinión experta de Sean ha sido muy importante en el propósito que nos anima desde la Fundación para buscar que el Estado colombiano clasifique a los residuos de asbesto como residuos peligrosos. Esta opinión experta ha estado sólidamente respaldada por evidencia científica que se ha obtenido en los laboratorios y en los análisis que Sean dirige en Durham, Carolina del Norte, donde hemos podido comprobar la presencia de abundante asbesto, producto de la meteorización de los materiales que contienen el mismo, con importantes repercusiones en el medio ambiente. Antes de cederle la palabra a nuestro invitado, queremos decirle que contamos con traducción simultánea en la parte inferior de su ventana de esta conferencia por Zoom, y para la sesión de preguntas y respuestas le recomendamos que las hagan llegar por el chat de esta misma conferencia. Bienvenidos todos, bienvenido Sean, y muchas gracias por aceptar nuestra amable invitación. Señoras y señores, con ustedes el señor Sean Fitzgerald. Adelante, Sean.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Yes, I think I'm going to have to shorten my bio so it doesn't take so long to just say who I am. I'm Sean Fitzgerald. I'm a geologist, a mineralogist. I've worked in asbestos testing and asbestos testing laboratories and in the field for over 35 years. And I've run laboratories in many different places. And I've also worked with many different countries and trying to help them better understand asbestos. And I truly have a passion for helping people understand the hazards of asbestos, how to test for asbestos, and why we need to pay attention, even though you may be exposed to asbestos and you don't fall over dead immediately. It's very important to recognize when you're inhaling these known carcinogens that can cause serious disease and early death if you're exposed at an early age. Now, I have with me, while I'm working on sharing my screen, I have with me today one of my employees that works in the laboratory here, Miguel Marquez, and I'd like him to say a few words from his perspective so that I'm not just thumping my chest and talking all about me. So I'm going to go ahead and set up. Miguel?
Hola, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Miguel Márquez. Yo crecí en una ciudad que se llama Montemorelos, en el estado de Nuevo León. Cursé la carrera de químico clínico biólogo en la Universidad de Montemorelos. Durante mi formación académica fue muy poco lo que se nos dio a conocer acerca del asbesto, y fue mayormente relacionado con las enfermedades que causa, como el mesotelioma y otras. Hace un par de años atrás, al estar trabajando en el laboratorio, terminando las líneas de Internet y el Wi-Fi, conocí al señor Sean Fitzgerald. Él y otra persona estaban poniendo los últimos toques para tener el TEM, el microscopio electrónico, listo para empezarlo a usar. Eso llamó mi atención y le comenté que yo sabía un poquito de eso y que cuando necesitara ayuda, pues yo le podía ayudar un poco. ¿Y cuál fue mi sorpresa? Que empecé al día siguiente. El conocimiento que he adquirido en este poco tiempo me ha abierto los ojos a la necesidad de aprender más acerca del asbesto y sus peligros. Sean, your turn.
Yes, thank you, Miguel. It's been very much a pleasure working with you. And when I go to Spanish-speaking countries, you've been very helpful, and you've indeed learned many things about asbestos, and have been a valuable asset to the growth of my laboratory. So thank you, Miguel, for that introduction. Did you mention which state you're from? Nuevo León?
Nuevo León. Es en el norte del país, pegado con Texas, bordering Texas.
Okay. Thanks again, Miguel. So anyway, I'm here to talk about the scientific definitions of asbestos and the considerations that we might think about moving forward in Latin America, specifically catered to the Mexican condition. So the first question that I'd like to ask everybody is, do you really know what asbestos is? Well, what I found is it kind of depends. There's actually many different definitions out there for what constitutes asbestos. And I've given you a few on the screen that are from the U.S. definitions, from the Environmental Protection Agency, from the United States Geologic Survey, from the ASTM International Committee that forms standards. In fact, this definition is from the soil method. I helped write it on committee with the ASTM group to determine asbestos in soil. And then there's what we published in the Federal Register in America as CFR 4763.80. The definition there says the asbestiform variety, and then names 6 different minerals. One serpentine mineral, chrysotile, which we're going to call off and on white asbestos, and then blue asbestos, asbesto azul, is of course going to be the chrysotillite, is the asbestos form of the mineral riebeckite. And then brown asbestos is amosite, which is actually short for the asbestos mines of South Africa. But from a mineralogist standpoint, it's fibrous cummingtonite or grunerite. And then we have 3 other minerals that are not often thought of from a commercial aspect. That's anthophyllite, tremolite, and actinolite. Those other 5 are all amphiboles. So there we go again. In most of our methods, not only in the U.S., but throughout the world now, it's become known as the fibrous variety or the asbestiform variety of these 6 minerals. But we're going to see in a minute, they're not technically minerals, but we're going to just forget about that. So this is a display here in North Carolina that shows all the different types of rock that are asbestos. And we can see that there's quite some variety in how they look in hand sample. These are the different morphologies of serpentine. You see that some of them aren't fibrous at all, but chemically they're all the same chemical formula. And I'm not going to rattle that out because it'll probably drive the translator crazy. You can see that one in the upper left is kind of fuzzy. Well, guess what? That's the asbestiform variety. That's chrysotile, the white asbestos. The others are not regulated because they're not fibrous, even though they're the same chemical formula, right? Okay, and in that definition, we had the word asbestiform. Well, what's that? Okay, asbestiform is a way that the actual minerals crystallize. They can either crystallize as a fiber or they can crystallize as a block, right? So the asbestiform habit is a habit where they form into individual fibers, and they separate sort of like string cheese, if you guys know what that is, or say the filter of a cigarette. You pull it apart and it makes all these little fibers. That's asbestiform, and when minerals do that, it is asbestos. So let's talk about the difference between a mineral and a rock. From a geologist, this is a little sticky point for me. It used to be that the word mineral meant anything that you dug out of the ground, period. That's what it meant. But more succinctly, as the science of geology and mineralogy has evolved, we now think of minerals as a naturally occurring substance that's solid at room temperature that has an ordered atomic structure. All right, it's made up of building blocks, and that ordered structure is representable by a succinct chemical formula. This is very important because a rock is not necessarily a singular mineral. It can be an aggregate of different minerals. It doesn't have a specific chemical composition in and of itself. So if you're saying, let me give you an example. Okay, a mineral. Let's think about a diamond. Okay, a diamond is a regular order of carbon, right? So it's a given formula is given, and its arrangement is given. That's what defines it. A rock, think something like a granite. A granite actually has several different minerals together. It can have mica, it can have quartz, and it can have feldspars that all compose part of the rock, but we still call it granite, right? It gets to be important when we start looking at what we've reckoned. We got contradictions here. Is a single fiber that we observe in a microscope, or is that asbestos or not? Can asbestos be a constituent of non-asbestiform population, or is a bundle asbestiform regardless of aspect? If it doesn't meet some of the criteria we set out to say that something's asbestos, is it asbestos? Now, what if it doesn't meet all of them? Is it still asbestos? And what we find out is perhaps asbestos is actually not just something we can set one definition on. We actually have dozens of definitions. Maybe it's just a great concept. So this is hard, makes it really hard to regulate. I can tell you this. This used to be the largest asbestos mine in the world, and it's in the Precambrian Shield of Canada, north of the Great Lakes, and is, as we will learn soon, the primary source for asbestos for decades, not only to the U.S. for over 30 years. This is where most of the asbestos in America, or the United States, came from. It also was a primary source for, until just recently, for the country of Mexico. So here's a chunk of serpentine. It's a rock, okay? But we can tell it's got more than one mineral because we see more than one type of habit. We see massive dark green rock, which is actually the serpentine minerals antigerite and lizardite. And then we have the fibrous variety, white chrysotile asbestos, and we have, like the interpreter was talking about, a big hammer on the table. What's that called? It's called a cobbing hammer. This is in the Mining Museum in Canada. And what they would do is they would take that hammer and whack the rock in order to get the fibers out. This is tedious work. So who got to do it? Why, the women and children, of course, right? And when I took the tour of the Thetford mines in Canada, this young lady was telling me in very broken English, her primary language is French, that this is the rock that we got asbestos out of. But then she said, there's no asbestos here anymore, even though I looked down between her toes and her flip-flops and I could see fiber bundles. I could see pure asbestos rope in that little box on the table in front of her. And then the corrugated asbestos board that's been snapped. So but she said there's no asbestos here. And if we looked on the wall, there was this chart that said in French, asbestos, a risk relatively negligible. That's, you would be more likely to get cancer if you ate a beefsteak or drove a bicycle. But this is on the wall trying to placate the French from worrying about the possible negative health ramifications from asbestos. And what I call this is the big elephant in the room. So let's talk about how small we're talking when we're talking about asbestos. We take a typical atmospheric dust sample, just the dust off the table, all right? And we look at it and we characterize it by size. We see that the vast majority of the weight of the material is actually very few of the total number of particles. You can see here that most of the particles in a typical atmospheric dust, millions of them, compared to a few hundred or thousand that are visible, are not visible by any kind of light microscope at all. All right, this is kind of the range that we're getting into when we start talking about the particles that are small enough to breathe into your lung, into the alveolar exchange region, where if it's asbestos, it can cause certain diseases like mesothelioma. All right, so many years ago, I took a penny out of my pocket and just to try to explain to people how small asbestos really is. All right, let's look at it under a stereo microscope. Let's take some rice grains out of my lunch, and let's take some hairs out of one of my lab's tech's head. All right, and we put that. I put that on the penny, and then I took some tweezers and took the smallest amount of asbestos fibers as I could, and I put it right underneath Lincoln's nose. Okay, that's over 100,000 individual fibers in that tiny little crumb. So this has actually been a very powerful demonstration. People always kind of go, wow, I had no idea that we're talking about something that's so incredibly small. In order to equate the width of one human hair, you have to have 400 of these individual fibers stacked side by side like a giant raft, right? Okay, so let's talk about how we can test for this stuff. How can we determine if something contains it? There's different kind of tools. Obviously, it's very small, so we're going to need to have some sort of magnification, some sort of microscope if we're going to be able to actually see it. And if we're concerned about breathing it, we need to be testing it in the air. All right, there's two main tools that we test for asbestos in the air. One of them is a simple light microscope called a phase contrast microscope. It's required here in the U.S. for monitoring places where we're actually taking asbestos out of buildings. It's only 400 times magnification. And as we can see, this is the only type of microscope you might find in Latin America. It's important. Now, we have a much higher powered microscope on the bottom. That guy takes up a whole room, and Miguel's probably going to walk over and show you what one looks like in just a minute. I'll point to his bubble if he gets over there, and I happen to notice it. The transmission electron microscope we're looking at stuff at 25,000 times magnification. And when we wrote the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act back in the 80s, we were worried about the asbestos that kids might breathe because it was most important because of dose-response relationship to protect the children from exposure to asbestos. So we wanted to make sure there was no asbestos by any method. So we used the most powerful powerful microscope, and that's when asbestos testing really took off in the United States. And then other countries started following suit. All right. So back to the PCM, we're basically looking at fibers. You can see it's a green screen, and we see fibers, and we can count them, and we can say, okay, there's this many fibers in the air per cc of air that we pulled through that filter that we're looking at, and we can consider that asbestos, but we're making some assumptions here. PCM can't differentiate asbestos from non-asbestos. They could be fibers from my shirt. They could be cellulose from ripping a piece of paper. All right, we're at a low magnification. We can't see the small stuff, and we can't necessarily say that's definitely one of the 6 minerals that were regulated as asbestos, or it's something else. All right, and also this was designed for use where there was high levels of asbestos fibers in the air. The methods that we use today were developed by Johns Manville, the largest asbestos-containing materials company in the U.S. So they were only documenting fibrous trends to make sure that there wasn't any asbestos in the air. So this is what a TEM grid looks like behind the TEM. Now, here we can look and find every structure, even the tiniest structures, only a tenth of a micron in width and only a few tenths of a micron even in length. Because we can magnify so high, we typically analyze at 25,000 times magnification. That's a lot more than the PCM at 400. So we're going to see it all if we get it into here. But it's a big machine, it's very expensive, and it might take me more than a day to teach you how to use it. So we have another kind of light microscope that's important. Now we're getting into bulk testing. That is, we're trying to determine if this piece of drywall or the ceiling tile or the floor tile, was it manufactured intentionally with asbestos, right? Now we can use something called a polarized light microscope. Notice that this guy has a round stage that we can turn versus a square stage that we just move back and forth like the PCM. The nifty thing here is we have different lenses that give us color. The colors tell us something about the minerals, and we can actually differentiate whether or not it's fibers from my shirt or if it's actually potentially asbestos by the optical characteristics under certain filters. But we're still not as high in magnification as TEM, and in some states in the US, and for some applications, like floor tiles that have very low fine asbestos added, it's required to go back and analyze after a PLM says, I don't see anything. You have to go in with the TEM and say, wait a minute, let's check it again. Okay, or not okay. All right, so like I said, with PLM, we get some pretty colors, right? Look at all these pretty colors. That's actually a chrysotile bundle, and you can see it changes color with orientation. Like in the first and third quadrant, it's blue. In the second and fourth quadrant, it's yellow in some of these pictures. Others, it goes from blue to magenta. Well, these are characteristic colors, so we can actually obviously see that they're fibers, and we can also say, all right, it has these optical characteristics consistent with asbestos. You really need one of these in order to say definitively you have asbestos. How many asbestos labs are there in Latin America that know how to use PLM? None. But okay, PLM is a useful tool, but it has limitations too. You have to have at least 1 to 5% of the material in order to differentiate it. There are other things that will give you colors kind of similar, so you need plenty of training in order to be able to use it correctly. But you can see that it's the asbestiform habit, and certainly if you intentionally added asbestos to a building material, this is the tool for you, all right? Once you're trained in this, you can pretty definitively say that ceiling contains asbestos or not, because it was intentionally manufactured with enough for us to see. And I just threw this slide in. This is what a pathologist sees. If they take a piece of tissue that may be diseased and they put a iron-specific stain, they can see these. It's called a ferruginous body. It's where fibers that were inhaled into this lung tissue sample had the alveolar macrophages, the T cells, all glommed onto this fiber and donated the proteins to build up these little kind of marshmallows on a stick, if you will. And we can see that in the iron-specific stain as these little nodules. And pathologist says, aha, this guy was exposed to asbestos. It's clear because he has ferruginous bodies. Now the cores, that is the fibers that these nodules are on, may or may not be the magic 6 regulated fibers. So here, again, we've got ambiguity with definition. Going back to our penny. Let's take some of that stuff from underneath Lincoln's nose and some of the other things, and let's put it on a PLM slide. We see the human hair now, and underneath it, we see a bundle of chrysotile fibers from underneath Lincoln's nose, but it's several fibers together, and that's what we need in order to be able to see it. If we take the same little bit of asbestos from underneath Lincoln's nose and we put it under the TEM, we can see that at higher magnification, here we are at 20,000 magnification, only fibers that are bigger than the yellow bar would be something that we could see with a PLM or a PCM. you can see that there are hundreds and hundreds of fibers that would not be observable just because they're too small. It's important because that's the size that we're worried about. That's the size that will get into your lungs and give you lung cancer, asbestosis, mesothelioma, right? The respirable size fraction. Now, we can put samples in here. We have very small grids going in the upper left. In the lower left, we see the chemistry, all right? Remember, I told you a mineral is a given chemistry and a given structure. The structure here is something called electron diffraction. That's where the electrons diffract through the crystal and tell us how far apart those building blocks are. Remember, we said it has to be a building block of a certain chemistry. So here we can see the chemistry and the structure with EDS and selected area electron diffraction. This way we can identify the minerals, and these are some examples I took. It was actually from a talc sample, all right? This talc sample had chrysotile asbestos. This is a single scroll of chrysotile asbestos, which you can't even see with a light microscope, but we can get chemistry off of it and structure definitive for the mineral chrysotile. Tremolite is not necessarily a commercial variety, but it occurs often in talc reserves. So this tremolite and this anthophyllite were identifiable by TEM. There's another kind of electron microscope called a scanning electron microscope. This scans the surface instead of transmitting through, so it doesn't have to have that really tall column. It can have this shorter column. But we have electrons that hit it, and we can get the energy that comes off and figure out what chemistry is there. So we can still find the chemistry, but we cannot get the diffraction pattern because the diffraction pattern has to go through, transmit through the sample. So SEM can be very useful, but it can't necessarily differentiate between different minerals that have the same chemistry or morphology. Like this. This is actually a bundle that contains both the regulated asbestos anthophyllite and the non-regulated fibrous talc. They're both in that same bundle together, and with SEM, you can't tell them apart. Going back to our ferruginous body, here's another nice application, though, of SEM, and many investigators throughout the world use scanning electron microscopy, especially in Europe, for the investigation of lung tissue. So this is a lung tissue where we're actually looking at a ferruginous body, and we're able to identify them with SEM. So when I showed you the picture of the big asbestos mine, I said that the largest asbestos manufacturer in the U.S. was Johns Manville. This is one of their flyers from back in the day. And we made asbestos into a lot of things in the U.S. And certainly throughout the world. But that's all kind of back in our history, at least here. We made cement asbestos shingles and bragged about how they never wore out. And it's interesting now, whenever we have asbestos in commercial buildings, we wear respirators, we have to do lots of testing, and wouldn't you know it, all the signs, because a lot of asbestos workers are Mexican immigrants, have to be in both English and Spanish. So we sprayed asbestos into buildings. Like the World Trade Centers had tons and tons of asbestos spray applied, including brown and white asbestos. We have pipe and boiler lagging. If it's in a condition like this, you better believe if you're in that room, you're going to breathe fibers if you're not wearing the appropriate respiratory protection. So the EPA at one time estimated that the asbestos materials are in 31,000 schools, 733,000 other public and commercial buildings in the U.S. All right. So we've been dealing with asbestos in buildings for 40 years at this point, but we've recognized it as a problem and we've stopped novel uses, although we haven't banned, believe it or not, the U.S. has not formally banned asbestos. It is very difficult to find it because of all the controls and the years of endeavor here in the States. And we actually had at one point 220,000 miles of cement asbestos pipe underneath our streets. Cement asbestos is perhaps the world's largest asbestos problem at this juncture today. We're still dealing with it everywhere, and as we see, we're definitely dealing with it throughout Latin America for many different reasons. Many of you have probably seen these corrugated roofs that look like this, or maybe the water tanks, or the pipes made out of asbestos cement. So in the U.S., we had kind of a peak of use in the mid-'70s, about 1973. Some say, some quote it as a little bit later, but we see that we had kind of a denouement, a reduction in use over time, to where 20 years ago, we pretty much weren't using asbestos in any practical applications in the U.S. whatsoever. The last holdouts were the vinyl floor tiles and the tar roofs. But those finally are no longer in use. Before that, we also had friction products, that is, things like brakes and clutches. And we still, to this day, can take brakes or clutches off of vehicles, especially if they were manufactured in other countries, like, say, I don't know, Japan or Mexico. They may well have asbestos in those friction products. So, but in the U.S., asbestos has kind of gone into the courtroom because we're trying to clean up all the problems. People are still getting sick. The mesothelioma rate has not quite gone down as fast as we thought it would. So we're dealing with people getting mesothelioma and trying to figure out where did their exposure come from. So I do a lot of expert testimony, as Guillermo mentioned at the beginning in the introduction. Most of the old business in the U.S. courts involves asbestos-containing building materials, friction products like those brakes and gaskets I just mentioned, electrical, there's lots of asbestos there, often these different chrysotile products. But as we'll see, a lot of courts buy into this idea that we should be looking for amphiboles and not worrying about white asbestos. Not something I agree with, but it's out there. We even made cigarettes in the U.S. With asbestos in the filters. We even advertised that our scientists and educators smoke these cigarettes preferential to others. And if you looked at the filter, I've got a couple over here actually, you can see the blue crucidolite asbestos in the filter. Fortunately, that was only for a few years back in the 50s. But yes, we still see, we've done many studies on the effects of asbestos from friction products. Some would say, importantly, that the friction products are well bound in the matrix. Therefore, there's no way you get any asbestos off of them. But that's not true for the guy whose hands look like this, who blows it around. And I actually changed brakes before I knew what asbestos was, and we used to have a little fun with the dust that was all over the garage when we did that. So yeah, this whole idea that chrysotile is not bad, it's the amphiboles that'll get you, is called the amphibole hypothesis. And there we have scientific research that looks at how long these different minerals last in your lung. And they say, well, chrysotile goes away. If you look at people that work in chrysotile mines, all the chrysotile goes away. But if they inhaled amphiboles, that sticks around. Well, what's interesting here as a geologist, and my rebuttal to that argument has been, if you look close enough, the way that white asbestos forms in the earth is very similar to the way that the amphiboles form in the earth. Take, for instance, that Johns Manville mine up in Canada, in Asbestos, Quebec. Here's a Canadian retired geologist that told me all about what minerals came out of there. And he said, yes, it's true. The primary mineral that came out of here was white chrysotile asbestos, but there was also antigerite and lizardite, the other polymorphs of serpentine, certainly, the big green guys that we saw in the rock with the hammer. But we also could see in hand sample fibrous tremolite, actinolite, and anthophyllite. Hey, these are three other forms of asbestos that, guess what, are amphiboles, all right? Coming out of the same hole, going to the same bag, and being sold as chrysotile, even though it includes these amphiboles. That's important. And I've actually done some testing on various chrysotile-containing products, like this light socket, that chrysotile woven braid around the edge, the gasket. I took that apart and put in the TEM, and sure, there's lots of chrysotile asbestos fibers, but if you look close enough, there's also a big fiber bundle of actinolite that I'm able to prove it has the right chemistry and diffraction for that mineral. And we can also see tremolite similarly in that same gasket. So this is important to note that when we say it's one mineral, there might be other minerals that contaminate it. And that's actually kind of comes into what's the new business that's going into the U.S. courts now. We're finding asbestos in talc. And talc, like chrysotile, is a sheet silicate. It can be contaminated with these same amphiboles. We're also seeing occupational cases where someone that worked in a mine that was shown to be contaminated might get sick. And ovarian is becoming huge because of the use of talc in the peritoneum of women. And then something called NOA, natural occurrences of asbestos. So these are kind of the new kids on the block when we try to go into the court and explain why Mrs. Perez got mesothelioma, right? So we have several different cosmetic talc products that I've tested over the years and found asbestos in many different brands. You may recognize a few. I'm certain everyone recognizes the big J&J right in the middle, Johnson & Johnson. Yeah, you know, we found asbestos in it, and that became a problem. And finally, just recently, Johnson & Johnson admitted, we don't think there's any asbestos in our talc, but because of all the controversy and all the court cases, we're going to take it off the shelf everywhere. And there's more than one. It's not just Johnson & Johnson. There's this product called Cashmere Bouquet. It was the #1 product for a company called Colgate Palmolive. And there are several other brands in which we found asbestos over and over. In PLM, sometimes we can see the asbestos fibers. This is all in a talc sample from upstate New York, here in the States. And that talc went into several different products. And I've done lots of testing. Some of the testing is like release testing, where we have to suit up and we build a chamber. Other times we're just using a glove box. Here we're testing some Johnson's baby powder from a friend of mine, Arthur Frank. He was actually given that when his son was born some 30 years ago. He never opened it, and I found asbestos in it. Here's some Avon products. Avon for some time actually put their talc into these little jars for various fragrances in Mexico, and then sold it back to the U.S. And here we see that this type of Avon had asbestos all through it. Look at all those fibers in the TEM micrograph. And I've also done investigations in some of these talc mines, like this talc mine in Montana, where I actually went there. Yep, sure enough. And I swung my hammer and I looked at some rocks. And sure enough, I found asbestos in the rocks in that talc mine. And in some places, you could actually see in the talc, you could see pseudomorphic fibers after the asbestos. So basically, you start with this and it becomes this over time. Pretty cool, huh? So this slide is out of place. What happened? All right, well, let's just go with that. We're going to see a mortar and pestle that's made out of serpentine in a minute. And this is actually some antigerite that's actually fibrous from that mortar. And the pestle, this is tremolite asbestos. But this is the correct slide. I apologize. This is some asbestos from that talc mine where I was just popped in with my goofy hat. And I've been talking about these different products and these different associations all over the world. And actually, I've testified in front of the FDA about the occurrence of asbestos in talc in February of 2020. And they actually came out with a paper saying we need to change the way that we test for asbestos based on these recent findings. And that was in December last year, and actually wasn't available until January of this year. So we're still fighting this battle here. It's not a dead thing. And it's all over the place. And it's not just in the U.S. It's also, I did testing of this very product. This is a clip from use of a talc that I tested, and I found this asbestos in. This was what was on the television when you turned it on in India. That's the exact same brand that I found loaded with tremolite asbestos. And I've talked about this in London and elsewhere in Europe. Like here I am instructing a scientist in Amsterdam on how to best test talc to determine asbestos. They were having trouble because they don't have electron microscopy. And when they do, it's just this SEM, not the TEM that I was using to find these very small fibers. And I've also worked with the international standards community as far away from me as Australia. That was a really cool trip. I understand the last talk was a guy from Australia. So yeah, they're dealing with it there as well. And it's not just the developed countries. In fact, recently I've been working, as Guillermo mentioned in the introduction, in Colombia. And when I flew into Colombia, this is what I saw looking out the window at the coastline in the city of Cartagena. And when I got to my hotel, I looked out from the rooftop and I could see corrugated cement asbestos absolutely everywhere. You could practically count it from the airplane, the number of houses that were covered with cement asbestos board. And yeah, we worked with some students at the University of Cartagena. Here's some of the students, and Miguel, who's back is to us actually, and one of the university professors. We're all learning how to test for asbestos, how to test in air and water, because they don't really have this ability. And I hope someday to further their testing and the teaching so that they can be completely autonomous with their own laboratories. And I hope the same for Mexico as well. So these cement asbestos roofs that are everywhere, I'm pretty certain if you've lived for a few years in Mexico, you've seen them before. I know I did when I've been to Mexico City. And if you look at the edges, sometimes you see these kind of drip line stalactites. All right. And what this is it's clear visual evidence that you can see in hand sample that these boards aren't holding the asbestos together. No, the fibers are coming out of them and they're reprecipitating. And as that raindrops fall, those asbestos fibers are going to get into the air. They are going to get into the soil, and they are going to pose real exposure. This is the surface of one of the cement asbestos boards that I brought back. I think it's one of the ones that I brought back from Colombia. And here you can see all these white fibers that's loose on the surface. I didn't abrade this or touch it at all. This is actually what the surface looks like. There's fibers flying off of this stuff with the lightest breeze. And you can pull them off. Here I am pulling it off with a pair of tweezers, and we can put that under a PLM. That's what it looks like under cross polars. You see that one little fiber that I pulled out of there is actually hundreds and hundreds of individual fibers, and we can raise the background color to magenta, and it looks like this. Now we can start to use optical characteristics to identify the asbestos type in PLM. So if you're trying to figure out if cement asbestos board contains asbestos, you need somebody to teach you PLM, and like yesterday. Here's a stereo microscope shot of another kind of asbestos. There's actually two kinds here. One's blue and one's white. Guess where they got those names? The chrysotile is blue and the chrysotile is white. We get them under the microscope, and the gray fibers that are pronounced are the chrysotile. The yellow fibers that are not as well pronounced is actually chrysotile. If we change the light and cross polars, across the polarizers, this is what we see. We see that all of those fibers are clearly asbestiform, but we don't know that they're two different types until we change the lenses again and we start to look at what colors they turn with different orientations. We can see that the chrysotile is blue in this orientation and the chrysotile is orange. This tells us something about the speed of light through the different orientations of those crystals. Not to get too complicated. And here's another picture. I just took this for Guillermo because I know he's an artist. This is both of those asbestos types from one of the cement asbestos boards, and then all the background is all calcium carbonate, the cement. The black here is not actually asbestos. There's a trick here. That's actually magnetite that grew in with the chrysotile. So just a little side note here. When we're talking about cement asbestos board, what I talked about in Cartagena, what I talked about in Bogota, is this idea of friable versus non-friable. If you can't crush it, it's non-friable, right? Well, that's not necessarily the case. Sure, insulation, soft insulation or ceiling tiles, you can crush those and the fibers all come out, and then it's considered a problem. But if you got a cement asbestos sheet or a floor tile, if you can't crush it with hand pressure, there unfortunately is a pervasive thought that asbestos fibers can't come off of it. But I think that you'll agree with me after seeing those pictures of the cement asbestos under even low magnification or hand sample with the selectite, that's not necessarily true. So we should actually think about whether or not the fibers are releasable or not. That's the more important thing that we should be considering. We should avoid this concept that friable is bad and non-friable is okay. All asbestos-containing material should be identified and treated as a potential hazard, period. And there's that mortar and pestle I mentioned earlier. Anyway, basically, I bought this at a drugstore, and in the serpentine, it was sold as green marble, but it's serpentine. I know this as a mineralogist. So I'm like, okay, well, let's see if any fibers come off. I ground it, pretended to grind spices, wiped it out, put it in the microscope, and I showed you that there was asbestos fibers in it earlier. Yeah, okay, here's another picture from the pestle. You can see, look at all these fibers. That just came from an emulation of regular use and wiping out. So these minerals will produce fibers, airborne fibers, in the respirable size fraction if you don't use them appropriately and treat them appropriately and know what you're doing. Let's talk about asbestos in Latin America. Asbestos has been banned in most industrialized countries. Yeah, except the US, but shh, don't tell anybody, right? Production and consumption have been shifted to the low and middle income countries. Asbestos consumption in Latin America is about 10% of the global production. So 1 out of every 10 bales of asbestos that are pulled out of the ground are sent to Latin America. Brazil is the only place where you actually pull out of the ground, though, and they're still mining in Brazil. They used to mine some in Colombia. They pulled out about a decade ago. Argentina, Chile, and Honduras, as well as Uruguay, are the only Latin American countries where they actually officially banned asbestos, with the exception of Colombia. They just banned it. But you know what? What I learned is they still need a lot of awareness and training, especially for asbestos that's already in place, like those cement asbestos boards we saw when we flew over Cartagena. So Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico were historically the main consumers in Latin America. If we look at the time period from 2013 to 2018, the majority of that material went into asbestos cement products. Now, I started to look to see, well, what asbestos labs are already there. There's got to be somebody, because we have hundreds and hundreds of asbestos labs here in the US and even in Europe and even in other countries like Australia. But you know what? I only saw 2 laboratories in Argentina, only 1 in Brazil, and 2 in Colombia. But none of them did anything but phase contrast microscopy. So we already saw they don't even know if it's truly asbestos. They're just counting fibers in the air, which could be from almost any source, and they have to be big enough to be seen. There's no labs that use electron microscopy, SEM or TEM, anywhere in Latin America. All right. Yes, there's some laboratories that have electron microscopes, but they're mostly universities, and they don't even know what to do when it comes to asbestos. So let's talk a little bit about asbestos in Mexico specifically. Yeah, there was an asbestos mine there. It's not currently producing. It's in Oaxaca. Is that how you pronounce it? It's a serpentine deposit. So it's that green rock with the chrysotile as the dominant ore. It also had in the gangue waste talc and tremolite. Interesting. So, but actually Mexico was never really a major asbestos exporter or producer. So let's just take that off the table for now. The majority of asbestos imported to Mexico, as I mentioned before, was historically Canadian chrysotile. From 80 to 2003, Mexico imported over 30,000 tons of prasidylite and amosite from South Africa. Remember, amosite itself stands for the asbestos mines of South Africa, and some of the largest reserves of prasidylite in the world are also found in Africa. Although there is substantial reserves in Bolivia, and it's why I think I'm seeing prasidylite in so many Colombian samples, but that's the more the graduate level here. Let's just get the basics down. There's about 1,881, there's exactly 1,881 Mexican companies who were importing asbestos in 2001. In the 1990s, Mexico used about 38,000 tons per year. Half of that was from Canada, 12% from the neighbor to the south, Brazil. And now we're down to about around 10 to a dozen thousand tons per year. And the Canadians have stopped pulling it out and selling it to Mexico. Of course, they increased significantly when the U.S. and Europe said, no, we don't want any more asbestos. We're not putting in products anymore. So Canada and others said, all right, we're going to send it all to Latin America. They'll buy it. Now, let's talk briefly about something else that keeps hitting me whenever the word Mexico comes up. If someone has mesothelioma and they live in America and they file suit to try to figure out who done it, the defense attorneys glom onto this thing called erionite. Erionite is a fibrous zeolite. It's called a tuft or a tuff that occurs in Mexico in a band where all the volcanic rocks are. And 2 papers have gone out into the peer-reviewed literature about this stuff called erionite, saying that there's clusters of malignant pleural mesothelioma in and around these villages and in that band of volcanic rock. So let's see where that is on a map. Here we are in mostly northern Jalisco, and the band of the 1, 2, 3, 4 examples goes all the way to the east to San Miguel de Allende, which caught my ear right away. My best friend from high school, believe it or not, teaches English in San Miguel de Allende this very day. So anyway, you had this band, and you can kind of tie it together. I just went on to Google Maps and said, all right, what if I wanted to drive to these 4 different towns? That kind of paints a line of where these fibrous zeolites might occur, south of Aguascalientes. I know that I'm butchering my Spanish. I apologize. But anyway, if we tried to drive it, we can see that would take we'd have to be driving all day long in order to hit all these towns. But we can see that it's this line of occurrence. Now, each of these occurrences might only be a small outcrop, or it could be a fairly large pit. There was actually some zeolite that was farmed in Jalisco at one time. But generally speaking, it's only here and there, not everywhere. It does look very fibrous and is very causative of negative health effects when you breathe it in. But you need to take that with a grain of salt. Consider, if you will, we don't have a predominant increase in asbestos cases, people that get sick with mesothelioma in the state of California, for instance, but all the green rock, all the rock marked green is ultramafic rock in the state of California. In fact, serpentine is a state rock of California, was named that because we had asbestos mines back in the day. Look at all the green on the map. And now let's go back and say, well, if we have a line of occasional occurrences through here, is that going to be responsible for all the mesotheliomas in Mexico that directly correlate with the dramatic increase in asbestos use in Latin America, especially since Canadian asbestos was shipped for many years directly to Mexico and put into so many products like those cement asbestos sheets. So that's kind of what I had.
Muchas gracias, Sean.
Yes, thank you.
Como siempre, muy ilustradora tu presentación, muy oportuna además para este contexto de México. Y vamos a abrir la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Esta sesión va a estar coordinada por Renata Cortés, que ella es doctora en antropología con especialidad en antropología médica. Recientemente ha estado trabajando en la respuesta de los movimientos sociales en América Latina frente a las emergencias sanitarias como la COVID-19, las aportaciones de las ciencias sociales a las emergencias sanitarias, así como las aportaciones de las ciencias sociales a cuestiones éticas, compartimiento de datos y participación comunitaria en contextos de acción humanitaria. Entonces, mi estimada Renata, te cedo la sesión para que coordines preguntas y respuestas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Sean, por todo el conocimiento que nos has compartido. Tenemos algunas preguntas del auditorio. Empezando con una pregunta que nos hace Octavio, uno de los miembros del equipo de investigación. Él dice, conociendo la estructura molecular, podemos entender mucho de las funciones que fueron tan útiles para la industria, como por ejemplo, su resistencia a la fricción. Pero ¿qué sabemos de los materiales que están sustituyendo a los que fueron hechos con asbesto? ¿Son seguros? ¿Cómo podríamos aprovechar los estudios sobre el asbesto para estas soluciones que la industria ahora maneja?
Okay. It seems like we have a multivariate question here. I'll do my best. I heard asbestos substitutes, and are they hazardous? Well, some would say mineral wool has negative health effects, but it's not nearly as pronounced as the asbestos minerals. It generally doesn't form the small pieces that can get down into the alveolar exchange region or cause specifically diseases like mesothelioma. There are other substitutes that don't really have any known negative health impact. Wollastonite is another fibrous mineral that can be used. It's a calcium sulfate. It is actually a peroxenoid, not a peroxin or an amphibole. Unfortunately, some of the studies that have been done are a little bit tainted because one of the sources from wollastonite was contaminated with asbestos. So you have to make sure that your reference material is good. And it takes a long time to really get these things into the tracheal or the peritoneum of rats and to actually get scientists engaged. And of course, scientists, to do this kind of study, they need money. And it's not easy getting grants, even in the US these days. So there's some substitutes out there that are certainly going to be less harmful, some that may prove to be perfectly adequate. And some would argue that there are some applications where you just can't replace it. Like the chlor-alkali industry says there's no real way to separate chlorine out for use in things like bleach without using asbestos as a filter. Also, the space program argues that, hey, who cares if there's asbestos in space, right? You're not going to breathe it. But generally, the only way to make sure that no one's exposed to asbestos is to not use it, to use detection methods to make sure that it's not in the air. And that's what I'm trying to present here. We've got, especially in Latin America, and in parts of Asia and certainly Africa, we have some serious problems where asbestos has become the go-to for. I remember when I was in Mexico City and I went to visit the pyramids. I saw all these homeless people living in, they just took pieces of cement asbestos board, they leaned it up against a post, and they're like, hey, that's home, right? We got a really big problem. And I know that we're not going to change it overnight, but awareness, this is the most important thing. If people understand how small asbestos is, that you have to have at least a light microscope and somebody that's been trained properly available. We've only got 5 laboratories in all of Latin America, and they're only using PCM. To me, it's almost a joke. But I'm just trying to understand, what can we do? How can we help? How can we not simply let the privileged few have children that are safe from asbestos and not even worry about the poor kids in Guadalajara or San Miguel de Allende?
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I have a comment. Well, I don't know if comment or a question. Years ago, I saw an advertisement of the Twin Towers.
Yes.
That highlighted the benefits of using asbesto because of against fire properties, you know? And currently, we are seeing an increase of cases of cancer in the US. The people that was exposed to all those, the dust that came from the demolition of those towers. So, do you have any comment about? Can we?
I could talk about just the World. I could talk about just the World Trade Center for hours. If you can't tell, I love talking about this stuff, even though it's horrible. It's my passion to try to understand this stuff because it's the only way that we're going to make our future less likely to be exposed to this known carcinogen. All right. In the late 80s, early 90s, I was working in a laboratory and we actually did samples of all the insulation from the World Trade Center. I looked at them with a microscope myself. All right. That was my job. And there was all kinds of asbestos. There was asbestos from Canada. There was asbestos from Montana. There was asbestos from England, Turner, Newell, Olympic. There were tons and tons of asbestos when they came down. Even though they would argue that they had already taken it all out, I know good and well that that's not true. I've also looked at the dust that was all around. I went to the Trinity Church right around the corner from there after the incident, and there was 2 inches of white dust that I put in the microscope and found asbestos fibers everywhere. Of course, there was a lot of other very gruesome things and very insalubrious health hazards present. And our illustrious President Bush gets up on the rubble with a megaphone and says, there's no immediate health risk. No immediate health risk. So yeah, it's public perception is a very tough thing that we have to manage here because, you know, the president, I understand why he said what he said. He said that because his advisors are thinking, we don't want everybody panicking for 20 years that they were somewhere near New York, right? We got 20 million people freaked out wanting to sue the Port Authority of New York. It's not going to work. So we have to say something, right? Well, what we have to say is we know that asbestos is a problem. We know that it's in these buildings. And yeah, we are going to see a decrease in asbestos incidents and asbestos-related disease, but we're going to see an increase because of the diabolic move to not stop taking it out of the earth, but to start taking what we were taking out of the earth and stop sending it to the wise guys in the U.S. and send it to those guys that don't know asbestos from squat down in Mexico. No. This is bad.
Yes, you're right. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
Regarding the industries that manufacture products that contain asbestos, What is the situation of dangers and risk of the workers of those factories?
And that's another really troublesome problem, because anytime you have an industry that starts having negative health effects, the first thing that the workers say is, why, I work for that company, my dad worked for that company for years, they paid for college for my kids, they paid for my mortgage of my house, I owe them everything that I am and have today. So if I get sick or my buddy gets sick, that's part of the cost of building a better, stronger nation. That's a very real precept that's very difficult to deal with. And what we find is that often these families of talc workers or asbestos workers or others that have been affected by these mineral dusts is a resistance to accurately report. We have to have a condition where it's undeniable, like we have in Libby, Montana, where half the town got mesothelioma. You can't say no to that, right? But then there's always going to be somebody else to blame. Another way to point a finger to somebody else, because of this whole, the problem is you inhale asbestos and you don't know it. You don't see it, you don't smell it. You might have a real hard time explaining to a lawyer 30 years from now where you were exposed to it, but we know that it causes disease. The analogy I like to use is you've got two kids upstairs and you go up to check on them and you open your son's door and he's smoking a cigarette. And you're like, where did you get that? Put that out. That could kill you. Do not smoke. That's bad. Now you go to your daughter's room, you open up the door, and she's putting makeup all on her face. All right? And you think, oh, isn't that nice? She's trying to look better. Aw. Right? But guess what? Both of your kids are doing the exact same thing. They are inhaling known carcinogens. The thing is, we're not aware. In the talc, in the sparkly makeup the little girls put on. But hey, man, back in the day, my first job, if I had a desk and I didn't have an ashtray sitting on that desk, I wasn't being nice to my guests. Even if I didn't smoke, it was an expectation that because everybody else always smoked, that you had that ashtray on your desk. Well, this is kind of the same idea. Now, if you dress up and go out, it's expected that you wear makeup. See the parallel? It's about awareness.
Yes, you're right, because sometimes in the scientific field, there's a narrative that is relating asbestos with considering asbestos as a source for respiratory diseases only for workers, but we are not thinking about all those people who is exposed because of makeup, because of many things, It's very important, your answer. Thank you. And we have another question.
Okay.
Is there any type?
Sí, nada más decirle al doctor Fitzgerald, tenemos aquí en la sesión a una persona que nos está ayudando a hacer el enlace con la Comisión Federal encargada de vigilar algunas de las sustancias tóxicas que entran en México. Es parte del proyecto hacer este tipo de vinculación. Está aquí presente y ha formulado una pregunta que creo que sería importante porque justo muchas de estas agencias estatales aquí en México están comenzando a abrir la carpeta de este tipo de problemáticas. Y me parece que sería importante aprovechar su presencia aquí para recuperar su pregunta. ¿Te parece, Renata? Está aquí ya planteada. Inclusive, Verónica, si quisieras presentarte y plantearla, estaría muy bien porque así estamos también, de alguna manera, inaugurando esta relación importante que tiene que hacerse entre los grupos de investigación con los actores estatales que pueden darle cauce también a estas y otras demandas.
Esa fue la pregunta anterior.
Es cierto, sí fue, se relaciona, ¿no? Bien, no, sí, nada más entonces, si Verónica quisieras decir algo al respecto y tomar un poquito el micrófono, estaría muy bien.
She said that she doesn't have microphone, not even camera, so she cannot speak right now.
No, ella puede hablar en este momento, ya se le habilitó.
Okay. No, she said that she can't. She doesn't have microphone, not even a camera, so she's not able, she's not available. Well, next question.
Okay.
Is there any type of filter or mask that prevents exposure to asbestos fibers? What is the protective equipment used to work with asbestos fibers, at least in the USA?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's actually many different kinds of masks that you can use. There's some that I think I showed earlier, a half face. Are you going to grab that? There's a half face that just has filters that can filter out the asbestos as you're breathing through them. There's also ones that completely cover you all the way up to supplied line, like scuba gear for divers. Here's the ones that I have when I'm out in the field. I have these guys. It's called a half face. And like I said, you know, you have these filters that will filter out some of the asbestos, but not all of the asbestos. You need higher respiratory protection factors with mask that is like a full face mask, but this was actually used by, believe it or not, Russian soldiers. All right, but unfortunately, this mask they made to save from things like mustard gas, right? And the filters themselves were made out of asbestos. So I just have that in my little shot. You have many different kinds of masks, and that's something else that I teach when I go to other countries. How to buy these masks, how to wear them properly, how to make sure that someone else. You actually take either banana oil or tear gas, and you put it around the mask to see if the person can smell it. So yeah, there's well-developed processes for the determination for respiratory protection. Just don't use this kind.
Thank you. What is the name of that mask you suggested that we use?
That's it's called half face. Half face because it uses half the face. Yes. And there's also full face, right? And there's ones where you can breathe in. I think we moved the PAPRs over to the other side. Anyway, there's also ones that have a filter that you wear on your belt called a powered air purifying respirator that has a fan, and it pulls through the fan and blows that into your face. And that has a much higher protection factor. It really depends on how much you think you're going to be exposed, and industrial hygienists in the asbestos control here in the U.S. are very particular about knowing how much asbestos might be released based on the condition of a material that you're exposed to, to make sure that we're below what are called permissible exposure limits that are set by OSHA and NIOSH. So you need to set those control limits. You need to find these respirators. The two brand names that are out there that you should be able to find online are 3M and North. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
And we have a question about what do you think of using synchrotron-based techniques like micro XRD to characterize asbestos?
Well, if you're in hand sample, XRD is great. It's going to tell you all the minerals that are present, but there can be different what are called interferences. Like if you're looking for the mineral talc, you can get interferences from the mineral chloride. If you're looking for anthophyllite asbestos, you can get interferences from tremolite, and it can be very difficult to tell them apart. So you have to have lots of the given mineral. You have to prepare them correctly, and interpreting the results. When I was in graduate school, we actually used to say, man, if you can interpret an XRD pattern correctly, then you deserve a PhD if you don't already have one, because it's just a bunch of lines. And you have to say, all right, these lines are resulting from the different layers in the crystal, and we're not looking through the microscope. We can't say that it's asbestos or not. That's the problem with XRD. It doesn't tell you that it's fibrous or asbestiform. It simply tells you that the mineral is present at some level of detectability. Generally speaking, that's not going to find the stuff that's the little tiny fibers, and that's important because little tiny fibers are the ones that you can inhale, that it will stay in your lung until they can produce the O3 radicals that are the seeds of cancers.
Okay, thank you.
Here's something for fun for you guys. This is one of those asbestos filters. You can almost see the blue fibers, yeah? So this is one of those cigarettes that was manufactured with a filter that had asbestos in it. Just for fun.
Wow. Our next question is, what is the most appropriate way for the remediation or confinement of asbestos in countries like Mexico? Well, in Mexico, we don't have a law, about it. And there are some enterprises that make this work, but we don't really know how they do it. Because they follow international regulation, as far as we know.
Right. Well, we have international methods for testing, and those use those same tools that I just showed you. You have to do testing in order to determine that it really is asbestos. And there's always going to be a cowboy somewhere who's going to say, I can tell if it's asbestos just by looking at it, but they're not always right. You have to get a microscope in there, and you have to know somebody that knows what they're doing. It's just like knowing any other rock. You might have somebody that thinks that they know right away that it's an emerald or whatever, but it might actually be a piece of green glass, right? So you need to have the right training from the right people. You need to educate the public of the potential hazards of asbestos, and you need a system. And in my opinion, it should be supported by the government. Unfortunately, one of the problems with asbestos here in the U.S. is that it's been pushed into the private sector through litigation. So it's a litigation-driven effort where it's sort of like our medical system. We don't have socialized medicine, and that's actually a problem. It makes it difficult, especially for the less privileged, shall we say. They can't get good health care until Obama came along. We did have a little bit of a kind of a Band-Aid, pun intended, on top of our lack of socialized medicine. But in Mexico, who's paying for all the disease that's going to get created from the wanton use of asbestos? Who's going to pay for that? Everybody in Mexico, because you do have socialized medicine, and it does fall back on the whole country as an unseen tax on our future of our children.
Thank you so much. Another question is, what do you think about the water storage tanks? What is known about this type of exposure?
Okay, when asbestos gets into the water, it gets to be what we call a sticky wicket. I don't know if you have that expression in Spanish. It is a bit of a problem because we don't have good peer-reviewed literature that says when it's in the water, it caused this disease or that. Although there's some papers out there, and if you dig, you'll start to see that asbestos gets into your gallbladder, it gets into your colon, and there have been links shown between ingestion of asbestos and various cancers. But it's not it's not enough to prove to IARC and the World Health Organization that asbestos in water is a significant problem. But hey, man, if you've got asbestos in water, what happens when you take a hot shower? You breathe steam. And what happens to those fibers? We actually do see that. We did a buddy of mine did a test of showers in California, and he found that because of the natural occurrence of asbestos in California, you can measure the asbestos in the tub because of all the asbestos in the water. So asbestos in water is a problem, and it's another big problem that, guess what, we haven't even really figured out here. But man, if you got cement asbestos tanks, they're going to be laden with water. Just like the water coming down that roof that made the stalactites, you're asking for a problem when you put a known carcinogen, even though the only known route of disease is by inhalation, into that water that may be aerosolized, dried out, and put into the air down the road. What if you water the lawn, right? Not that there's very much grass forming in Mexico, but if you put it out on the lawn, you water your plants, that dries out, and there's wind, there's little dust devils. Those dust devils are going to have some asbestos because of the asbestos that was in the water. If it's of a high enough level, again, it comes back to testing. If you don't test for it, you don't know it's there. Will you have asbestos in a water storage tank that's made out of cement asbestos board? Yes. So if that's your real question, the answer is yes. That water will contain asbestos, and the longer that water sits there, and the further from a pH of 7 that water is, the more likely there's going to be more fibers. And everybody knows cement has a very high pH, right?
Thank you so much. One of the members of our team is gonna make those measures of asbestos in soil. Maybe he can ask more questions. Javier, do you have more questions about it? No, I think he doesn't have more questions. Well,
yeah, asbestos in soil is very tricky. Just to see if he can pull up his microphone or whatever. Asbestos in soil is very, very tricky because obviously it can be from so many different sources. It could be from asbestos pipes or something, or from above, from an actual asbestos material contamination, or it can be natural occurrences of asbestos like that erionite, fibrous zeolite we talked about, or chrysotile if you live on serpentine soils. So there's lots of different ways that soil can contain asbestos, and it gets really tricky because you're dealing with a natural system, and you have so many different variations in the way that soil can have asbestos, and then what's detectable and what's not. I've done a lot of naturally occurring asbestos work in California, and we've had to go back where soil, yes, that's much better. Yes, we have to go back on jobs that are botched because they try to do what you would do with asbestos in a building material with asbestos in soil, and it doesn't necessarily work. In the asbestos in soil method that we published to ASTM, we said, hey, you got to make sure that whoever's taking the samples knows something about soil or geology, not just some guy that's been trained. Take a sample every 5 feet. What happens if you do that and 2 feet from the nearest point, there's a vein of pure asbestos? Representative sampling comes into play and can be really difficult.
Oh, that's a big task to think about.
Yes. So it really depends on why you think this soil might have asbestos. You get back to the root cause. You have to do a lot of detective work in the laboratory, forensics. You end up doing a lot of detective work in order to figure out what it is you're looking for and why.
Thank you.
Sure.
And the next question is from the famous case of Johnson & Johnson talk with asbestos. Do you know if some regulation has emerged that requires that those products that are likely to be contaminated with asbestos must be studied to rule out of the presence of asbestos?
I don't know that that's.
Okay. So there's no regulation yet in the USA after that case?
Are we waiting for someone to catch up?
Hola? So there is no regulation yet in the USA after that case of Johnson & Johnson?
The short answer is no.
No, okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're working on it. I showed you the picture in the FDA, and I said that they came out with a publication in December. That publication is about that thick. It's sitting on my desk over here. And it's a suggestion from the interagency working group that was brought together by the US FDA on how we need to change how we test talc for the presence of asbestos because of this sparkly makeup the little girls were putting on in their room, right? No, we have not regulated it. It has simply been, again, back as a secular effort, and the government is struggling here to catch up. And they haven't caught up yet. We're getting there, I hope.
Well, it's a pity that there is not a regulation yet, but we hope that you have it in the future. And
right.
Our last question is, for the state agencies that are in charge of watching over or monitoring toxic agents like asbestos,
right.
What program and strategies do you know that could inspire you to channel resources and equipment for adequate surveillance and regulation?
Could you repeat or maybe rephrase that? I'm not sure I got that.
Okay. For the state agencies that are in charge of watching over toxic agents, like asbestos, do you know a program or a strategy that could inspire you to channel resources and equipment for adequate surveillance and regulation?
Yes, I mean, basically any of the states here. I can't speak to the different states in Mexico, but the different states here all have specific regulations, and some of them are slightly different, but they all basically use the same methods and methodologies. They identify that there's a problem, they do the bulk testing, and they're required certain levels of concern nationally. For bulk asbestos building materials, we are regulated at 1% by weight, observable by PLM, as a differentiator between non-asbestos containing material and asbestos containing material, unless you're in the state of California, and then that goes down to 0.1%. So if you have something that's 0.5% asbestos and you're in Oregon, you're fine. But as soon as you cross down into California, boy, it becomes asbestos. So there's some difference that are very, very slight between different states' interpretations, or some states like New York and New Jersey want you to do more extensive testing. Like I said, on bulk testing, some states require for certain materials that you go ahead and retest any negative results by electron microscopy. Not every state requires that for those same materials. But I would definitely, fortunately or unfortunately, we're on the forefront because we first realized the negative health impact based on New York studies done by Irving Selikoff in New York, where we first started saying, okay, yeah, asbestos has negative health effects. That kind of spurred the formation of many different environmental groups when we were able to put them together. In the 60s, we put together the EPA, we put together OSHA and NIOSH, and these different bodies were the driving force for making the regulations that became the dawn of the asbestos control industry and the asbestos testing industry. And other countries have fallen in line with those same protocols. And with some big differences when we start going into other countries. For instance, England didn't want to use electron microscopy. They're regretting that decision now. They're actually asking people like me to help them develop standards that can see all of the asbestos and things like that. In Northern Europe, like I showed you a picture of the SEM in Amsterdam. They actually have developed tools that use electron microscopy, but some of the key scientists there were biased toward the SEM because the SEM was more accessible and easier to find than, so they didn't write the TEM into the protocols like we did here in the US. And that's caused some problems, but it means that their protocols for testing is very good in comparison with other countries, and obviously countries where you have no testing mandates or controls at all. It's vastly superior. So it really runs the gamut of ways, but you have to drive first. There has to be public awareness, and that's why the U.S. kind of was a forerunner, is because we became the first people to realize there's a problem, and that problem is not small, and once you started getting people concerned, especially moms thinking their kids are going to die, that's when you started actually getting things to change, and that's what we're seeing now with talc. The whole Johnson & Johnson thing is a relatively new story, but the truth of it is we knew that talc could contain asbestos 150 years ago. It's just there wasn't a bunch of mothers who were worried, oh my God, I killed my child by powdering their butt when they were a baby.
Thank you. And we have one more question.
Okay.
We know that there are many environmental pollutants. Do you think that asbesto, how harmful is asbesto when compared with other pollutants?
That's a good question, and that's a really tough one to answer because, yeah, I'm an asbestos expert. I'm also an expert on heavy metals. Would I say that asbestos is worse than heavy metals or lead is worse than mercury? No. They're all different things, and we need to be aware of lead and arsenic and cadmium and chromium, right? We need to understand all of these things. Asbestos is a rather pervasive problem because it's so easy to forget, because you can't smell it, and we really don't even know, you can't see it, we don't really know how many diseases are really attributable, and the more we investigate, the more that we learn. Now we're seeing that thoracic, pancreatic cancers, and ovarian cancer is huge, especially now that we're starting to think about talcum powder. We used to call it, instead of the bathroom or the toilet, we used to call it the powder room because it was ubiquitous, especially among women, to use powder hygienically regularly. Now we're seeing, maybe we know why we have such a huge incidence of ovarian cancer in the States.
No tenemos más preguntas. Te agradecemos muchísimo tu tiempo, todo el conocimiento que nos has compartido y creo que sobre todo las sugerencias y que nos has hecho para un plan, para un programa. que pueda contemplar la medición del asbesto, dónde está el asbesto, qué es asbesto, y algunas pistas sobre los equipos que tenemos que utilizar, cosas que damos por sentadas, pero creo que son sumamente importantes. Muchas gracias, fue un gusto conocerte y ojalá que podamos vernos en otra ocasión.
Muchas gracias,
Yes, I wish I could be there. Mexico City is a wonderful place to visit. I've been there a few times, and thank you for this forum and your attention. Like I said, I love to teach and glad to be here.
Octavio quiere hablar, quiere decir algo.
Muchas gracias, Sean. Ha sido una presentación admirable. ¿Vas a intervenir, Octavio? Gracias, Sean, de nuevo. Gracias, Miguel. Gracias al equipo técnico por toda la colaboración. Gracias a todos los participantes. Nuestro próximo invitado es Barry Castleman. Y Barry está entre la audiencia. Barry está programado para el próximo 7 de septiembre. Barry, si tú quieres decir algo, he pedido que por favor hablen en el micrófono. Si tú quieres dar algunas palabras y darnos un poco tu opinión de lo que piensas que México esté buscando prohibir el asbesto y la posibilidad de que desde el movimiento internacional y un referente tan importante como eres tú, pueda existir apoyo a este tipo de iniciativas. Sean está mostrando el libro de Barry. Para todos los que seguimos y luchamos por prohibir el asbesto en el mundo, Barry es un referente definitivo. Lo llamamos state of the art. No hay pregunta, no hay duda que uno le consulte a Barry sin que él responda diciendo con precisión y en muchos casos citando alguna parte de su libro la respuesta que uno anda buscando. Alguna vez Barry me comentaba que en Estados Unidos la industria del asbesto revisó con lupa todas las palabras que él estaba expresando en su libro y no encontraron una sola razón para demandar a Barry. Y en ese sentido, pues, me emociona tenerlo acá enormemente. Y dale, Barry. Welcome. Welcome on board, my friend.
Jump in, Barry.
Hola, Guillermo. Mi español no está bueno, pero
Es bueno.
otro tiempo.
You can speak in English too. We have a translator.
Yeah, well, you know, you were asking about how you compare asbestos to other toxic substances. And from a public health point of view, it stands, you know, as a huge cause of occupational and environmental disease compared to other toxic substances. Something like half of the occupational cancers that have been identified in the projections of the experts are asbestos-related cancers from all the toxic substances, from all the carcinogens used in industry. Asbestos, I mean, the others probably cause plenty of cancers we haven't identified as being related to them. But from what we know, the asbestos takes up half of the total. You know, the various estimates have projected something like 250,000 deaths a year worldwide from asbestos. The expansion of the use of asbestos in the developing countries was something I feared when I started investigating this in Mexico in 1973. You know, when we started regulating things, the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA were only created in 1970. And so it was only a few years after that that you actually start to see an effect in the peaking and then the rapid decline of asbestos consumption per year in the United States. But yes, it's a very significant problem. And this has been known for an awfully long time because it was back at Selikoff's conference in 1964 that Newhouse and Thompson presented epidemiological data showing that mesotheliomas were occurring not just in people who worked with asbestos, but in the neighbors of the asbestos factories and in the household members of the asbestos workers. this was done by an epidemiological study. So it had powerful evidence to the effect that asbestos was that lethal. And then if you just took a look at the population at risk, when that was proven, when that was shown in the mid-60s, it was obvious that asbestos use would really have to be drastically reduced. I started reading about this in 1970 as a master's student, and the use of asbestos after 1965 kept on going up because the companies were on their honor to behave themselves, and you know what happened. So anyway, that's my comment for the night. It's late. Have a nice evening, folks. And I'll be back.
Muchas gracias, Barry. Un cierre maravilloso, pues, después de esa presentación de Sean. Agradecerle de nuevo a todos por su participación y nos vemos el próximo 7 de septiembre a las 6 de la tarde. Definiremos esa hora con Barry para oír su conferencia, que estoy seguro será tan interesante como nuestros invitados, Sean y Philip. Sean, de nuevo, muchísimas gracias. Eres muy amable por compartir tu experiencia y tus conocimientos. Aplausos. Gracias a todos. Hasta luego.